How's it going, Eliminators? Today, we're going to be working on what's known as a Brownie's third lung. Essentially, it's just an engine with an air pump that's used to supply air to a scuba diver. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So I got a really cool video lined up for you guys today. We're going to be working on what's known as a third lung. This is essentially, like I said, an engine connected to an air pump that's used for diving. It is made by a company called Brownies. I'm just going to be briefly going over how this system works, and then we're going to get into what's wrong with it and hopefully fix it up. So what's really cool about this unit is it has an actual Honda engine on it. This is a 2.2 horsepower Honda G100 engine. So parts are not going to be that hard to find if I do need engine parts, which I do believe we're going to be digging into the carburetor because my customer said that this hasn't run in I think about 5 years. So the crankshaft comes out of the engine to a pulley, and then there is a cogged V-belt underneath this belt housing here that goes to a pulley that powers the air compressor. This piece of wood right here is not factory, but I'm assuming they put that in between the engine and the compressor to mitigate some form of vibration, I'm assuming. So obviously, once you fire up the engine, the pump is running immediately because that belt is always under tension. Now, here is your air intake. In order to start the engine, you have to unplug the air intake to relieve pressure off of the air compressor. So now that air can be drawn into the compressor, once that air is compressed, it then comes out this black tube that goes down to the diver. Now, there is a little bit more to this unit than what you see in front of you. There is normally some type of flagpole that goes up. Basically, it's a hollow tube, and that's going to act as an extended air intake so that you don't get water into the air compressor, as well as an inflatable tube here on the base of the unit. So normally what you would do is you would fire up this unit and then hook the inflatable up to the air pump to inflate the inflatable. And then once that's inflated, then you can essentially float that on the top of the water, and that acts as your dive station. Pretty cool stuff here, and I've never worked on anything like this. My customer did say that the fuel leaks from the petcock here, the fuel valve. Not sure if you're going to be able to see it, but a little bit wet around that area. However, he also said that he put fresh fuel in it and tried to start it, and the unit would not start. So I'm assuming that the carb's a little bit gummed up and it's just not drawing fuel. Now, before we tear into the carburetor, my customer did say that he replaced the spark plug. However, inside of it is a CJ8. And Honda actually recommends that this engine take a BPMR4A plug. And on this particular engine, a spark plug gap of anywhere between 28 thousandths of an inch and 35 thousandths of an inch is acceptable. So I'll probably end up gapping this spark plug at approximately 30 thousandths of an inch. So I've installed the new NGK plug. Essentially, that just allows me to rule out any issues that this plug may have. Additionally, this is just a CJ8 plug. This is not an RCJ8Y like Honda recommends. And there's going to be a couple differences. The R stands for resistor. So because this is not an RC plug, it means that there is no resistor built into it, which means that this plug could negatively affect some electrical components around the vicinity of this machine when it's running. So that's why you primarily want to be running resistor plugs, especially nowadays with so many electronics. And similar to a resistor spark plug, if you've ever noticed on some electrical cords, you have these like plastic squares or rectangles near the plug. That is acting as the same thing. It's basically going to help eliminate a little bit of that electric interference that these electrical components are creating. And then before we get into the carburetor, I just wanted to share this. This is pretty cool. Got a little dive chart here for non-repetitive first dives. This is your no decompression limits. So in order to get this off, you're just going to pull at the bottom. It hinges at the top right there, and then it latches at the bottom. And there's a little air filter in here, so we can go ahead and remove that. And then what I'm going to do is, with the choke in the off position, so the butterfly valve is straight, I'm going to spray some carb cleaner in there. And then again, with the intake cap off, I'm just going to go ahead and pull this thing and see if it fires. That'll let me know if we have spark and if we have compression and if it's worth fixing. Not too much, just a little bit. Well, that's a good sign when they fire up on the first pull like that when you spray them with some carb cleaner. And I don't know the condition of the fuel that's in there, especially since this unit has been sitting for so long. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is come to the bottom of the fuel line. I'm going to remove that, and then we'll drain the fuel from the tank. That way it'll tell me if there is fuel flowing. If there's not, there could be a blockage, and at least if the fuel is flowing, we can eliminate the tank as an issue. And also, upon further inspection, I can see that the fuel line has some tears in it, so that could lead to a little bit of fuel leakage as well. So by removing this little air filter backing plate, we can see that there are two 8mm nuts there on studs that run back into the engine. Pull this off, and I don't want to pull the breather tube out of that hole if I don't have to, so I'm just gonna kind of let that hang for now. Now, because this carburetor hasn't been off this engine in a long time, the carburetor was seized to the engine. Now, there's going to be a black plastic heat spacer in between the aluminum carb and the engine. So you don't want to go in and just start prying in there, because you can end up cracking your heat spacer, and then your engine's going to run lean. It's going to be revving real high because it's going to be sucking air from there. So what I did instead was I came over to this spot right here just with a screwdriver, and I pried on the corner of the carburetor just to break it free. And then I can now go ahead and probably cut my fuel line, because this fuel line here is incredibly rigid, so I'll probably cut that. All right, so check this out. I cut the fuel line. You guys can see that it's dripping there. You might notice if I shake this, there is some fuel in there. Not too much, but there is some. So it should be draining better than what it is. I know this is an older style Honda engine, but these metal tanks, as you guys can probably see in there, they rust and they get all sorts of crap in there. So normally they have a fuel filter right here that screws into the tank. So that could be clogged, and it could be creating a fuel supply issue. So it might just be starving for fuel. But now that the fuel line's been cut, I can pull the carburetor forward, which will allow me to pull on the governor linkage there. Just gotta unplug that right there, and then I can take the carb off and bring it to the workbench. I've opted for a smaller glass jar here. I just want to see if there's a difference in flow when I remove what I think is going to be the filter. Yeah, check that out, guys. So it's definitely clogged. So I'm gonna go back to the bigger jar and drain that out. And there's your filter. So this is what is clogged and preventing flow. I have these, and they're plastic, so they just screw right up in there, and then they have a washer that goes around the base there. So hopefully it's the same thread. I'm sure it is, because Honda generally uses the same parts on multiple engines. So there's our fuel supply issue solved. All right, so I've drained the fuel out of the tank and tried my best to get it as clean as possible inside of there. Wherever you see the darker colored stuff though, that's actually rust. So I'll try to get some. You guys can see here that it's incredibly fine, almost like a sand. That's all rust in there. So I'm actually going to show you guys a quick little trick to help you guys clean out a steel fuel tank the best you can without using any expensive products. So on the carb side of the fuel tank, we have one bolt there, looks like a 10mm. And then on the other side, we have two, what looks to be like 10mm nuts. And then once we remove them, I'll be able to remove the fuel tank. I'm going to be using a little bit of CLR, not too much, just a little bit. And then you get basically a handful of nuts and bolts. You can use smaller or bigger, it doesn't really matter. And what you're going to be doing is putting the CLR and the nuts and bolts into the tank. Put the cap back on, and then we're going to be shaking this thing up. And what's going to happen is the CLR is going to attack all of the rust inside of that metal tank, and the nuts and bolts in there are going to work as an agitator to hopefully break away as much as possible. So I have my CLR here. You guys can see that this one says septic safe. I seem to remember that the old school CLR had the corrosive skeleton symbol down on the bottom. This one doesn't. It just says that it's an irritant, so I am wearing some protective gloves. But I'm just going to take a little bit of this and dump it into the fuel tank. Now I do have the fuel filter screwed back into the tank, and I put just a tiny little bolt in there so that the CLR doesn't come out. We don't need too much, just enough to coat the inside once we start shaking it up. Take some nuts and bolts and go ahead and dump them into the tank. Then we're going to put the cap back on, tighten that up. We're going to shake this thing up. You guys can see that the cap is leaking. So I am wearing some safety glasses again, as well as some gloves. And I'm just going to keep shaking this thing up, and then we're going to open it up and see how it looks. So I've been shaking this for a little while now, and I've put some fuel into it. And you guys are going to see the fuel looks fairly clear, but there's going to be some nasty gunk. Look at that coming out of this thing, so I'm gonna have to do a couple flushes. By the way, that is the fuel that we drained out of there. Check that out. Disgusting. All right, so I shook the fuel tank around a few times with the CLR in it, kept draining it back out, putting it back in, each time removing some debris, and then did a couple flushes with fuel, and here is the final product. Now, it's not perfect. You guys are gonna notice, like, there is some very tiny amounts of rust left, but check this out. Try to get a good shot. I'm gonna say like 85 to 90%, especially the big stuff, is gone. So I don't have to worry about the new fuel filter that I'm gonna put into it clogging up due to just a whole bunch of rust in there. So with the old fuel filter removed, there was a gasket that was attached to the tank. I'm going to be installing a Sten's part number 120-327 fuel joint assembly. You guys can see there that it fits Honda GX110 to GX390 engines. Again, this is off a G100. It looks like the same threads. Try to get a picture. This one is plastic, so it's not metal like the old days, and it comes with some fuel line clamps as well, so I'll be able to thread that in. Hopefully it fits. That is a 12 mil, so you can use a 12 millimeter wrench to tighten that down. You don't want to tighten it up too much because, again, this one's plastic, so you don't want to strip the threads, but there is going to be that black rubber gasket there that you are going to have to compress, and then that'll ensure that you're not getting a fuel leak. And then just to show you guys, I have some new fuel line attached. This one's longer than it needs to be, but I get this generic, so this is just like pre-cut pieces, and then I made sure that my end here fits onto the carburetor fuel inlet, which it does. And now that the fuel tank's taken care of, the carb is the next thing that we're going to dive into. All right, so to start things off, my customer complained that the fuel valve was leaking. This here is the fuel valve sump, and then there is an O-ring that goes inside of there. On the top of these, there are two Phillips head screws, and there's this cap. We're going to remove that, and there is a wave washer underneath that, and the wave washer acts as a spring to keep tension down on your fuel valve lever here. There's also a gasket that's going to be inside of there, so that could be worn. Now, Sten's does make Honda GX style carb gasket kits. There's your part number 485-006. That replaces your Honda number. This fits a variety of GX engines. Once you get those Phillips head screws off, you can take the top off. Here is the wave washer that I was talking about. So you guys can see it's deformed. It's supposed to be like that. So when you tighten that top plate down, that keeps spring tension up against this right here. That's what keeps tension on it, so that when you move it, it doesn't vibrate over on its own. And then there is that little gasket, and we may get lucky. These parts may be interchangeable, so I just used a small screwdriver to pry that gasket out, and I'm over here doing a little comparison. And shout out to Honda, because those parts are identical. So now that I know I can reuse some of my carb parts that I have in stock to hopefully rebuild this carb, I'm taking the bowl bolt off, and we're going to remove the bowl. Wow. Check this out, guys. That's all rust in there. Probably build up from some other stuff as well, but not sure if I'm going to be able to clean this carb up. This carb here is in pretty bad condition. Try to take the float out here. Needle valve, seat, made out of plastic on this one with plastic float rod towers. So you guys don't want to break those. The interesting thing here is going to be, will the main jet come out? And I'm unthreading something. Or maybe I'm not. It's hard to say. Look at the amount of gunk in there, guys. So you guys are seeing this as I take it apart. Absolutely loaded with debris in there. All right, so a little update on this G100 carburetor. I've been trying with no success to get the main jet out of that tube there, either stripped or I don't know what's going on, but the main jet's not coming out. And to get the distribution tube, which is further down that tube, out of this, you have to remove the main jet. The main jet unthreads to about there, and it's supposed to keep threading out until it gets to there, and then this is where it's threaded for the bull bolt right there, and then normally from that point it drops out. But like I said, I got a few turns off of it and then it's just spinning. So interestingly enough, I did some research online. A Honda G100, I guess, is also referred to as a Honda GX100. Would make sense why carb parts are interchangeable. But I did a quick search on Amazon, and I can get a carb on Amazon Canada for $18 Canadian. Shipped Amazon Prime, be here tomorrow. So I went ahead and ordered it. You guys can see there's over 660 4.5-star reviews. So even though it's relatively inexpensive, it is a decent quality product. About 90% of the reviews are positive. Now, normally I don't like replacing an OEM Japanese carburetor with a Chinese one that come off of Amazon. However, you guys got to understand that I'm going to have to ultrasonic clean this thing. Even once I clean it, if I can't get that main jet out, I will not be able to see the condition of the distribution tube. So ideally, the main jet and the distribution tube need to come out. And the thing is, for the time I'm going to spend, I'm going to have to probably end up replacing the bowl. Even once you clean this up, the rust has attacked this gold coating. Once that gold coating is eaten away, it starts to rust, because this is probably a lot of rust that came out of the metal tank. So then the rust eats away at the coating, and then now this, which is metal, ends up rusting. So I'm going to have to replace the bowl, probably needle valve as well, right? And then you're looking at a full carb rebuild kit. I'm going to have to clean it, spend time to rebuild it. So price and time taken into consideration, go ahead and replace it with something that, 90% of people are saying it works. All right, so it's the very next day and I got my carburetor in from Amazon. We're going to go over what comes in the box and the differences between the two carburetors, because they're slightly different, but for the most part, they're very similar. So in the box, they give you a fuel line. I get them with replacement carburetors. You also get a bag full of gaskets, which is really nice because when we took the old carburetor off, one of the gaskets tore. And then obviously we have the carburetor. So the first thing you might notice is on the original, we had that big long sediment bowl for the fuel valve. On this one, we don't have that. It's just the fuel shutoff valve. We have a bent fuel inlet there, whereas this one has the 90-degree, but you're gonna notice they both have the fuel adjustment screw, which is going to be nice because it will give you a little bit of adjustability. Apart from that, though, they both have the choke lever on top there. The throttle hookup is similar, and we also have the pilot jet right there on the side. And with this carburetor, again, comes a brand new bowl. So going back to the old carburetor and the bowl you guys saw there, if I had to replace this bowl and then go ahead and replace the float needle valve there, again, having to replace all of the gaskets, I'm going to have to sink some money into that. The bowl could be like $11. You're looking at about $5 for a needle valve, and that's not even including the time to go ahead and clean that. So again, for like $18 Canadian, I just went ahead and bought the aftermarket one. Now, you probably noticed that I do have my carburetor pressure tester here, and I'm using an even smaller OD fuel line that I stuffed into the larger rubber fuel line there to act as a step down to hook up to the smaller fuel inlet on these Honda and MTD carbs. So I always pressure test carburetors, whether they're new or cleaned and rebuilt, before I install them onto the machine. And the pressure tester pressure tests the seal of the needle valve, again, to ensure that it doesn't end up leaking and flooding fuel into the engine. One of the most important things though is when you have a carburetor with one of these fuel shutoff valves is we're going to put the fuel valve into the off position. I'm going to hook up my carb pressure tester to the fuel inlet, and then we're going to pressurize it. And you're going to want to see around 5 psi without the carb pressure tester gauge going down. So you guys can see here, I just have the carb laying on its side. Normally you can't do this, but we're pressure testing the fuel valve, which is in the off position. I've hooked up my fuel line, and coming down to the gauge, you're going to notice that it's holding at 5 psi. So that means that the fuel shutoff valve works. Now what you're going to want to do is go ahead and open this, and when you open it, that gauge should go down to 0 as long as your float is in the down position and your needle valve is down. So that means that it will let fuel through when it's in the on position, and it won't let fuel through when it's in the off position. Next up, with the fuel valve set to the on position, flip your carburetor upside down so that the bowl is up, and then pressure test your carb tester and see if it holds. Now this does, which means this carb will not leak. And just as an added tip for pressure testing carburetors, if you are ever pressure testing a carb and you notice that whatever you do, the needle or the fuel valve has a slow leak, you can go ahead and take some penetrating oil in a pressurized can or a little bit of 3-in-1 oil, and with the fuel valve set to the on position, go ahead and squirt just a small amount into the fuel inlet. What that does is it wets all of the O-rings and seals, as well as the rubber-tipped needle valve inside of the carburetor, and it will simulate a little bit of fuel being in that carb, because a lot of times if you guys go to use your pressure tester and the carburetor is dry, it will have a slow leak, and you don't want that, because then you're going to be thinking maybe it's a bad carburetor, you're going to send it back. So again, a little tip, use a little bit of penetrating oil, wet the needle valve tip or all of the gaskets, and it should help things seal up. You'll also want to take your 10mm wrench and make sure that not only the bowl bolt is tight, but also the bowl drain bolt. Many times when I've gotten these aftermarket or even some OEM carburetors, they've been a little loose and I had a leak either around the bowl gasket where it seals to the carb or at the bolt. So I'm now ready to reinstall the carburetor onto the engine here. But before we do that, we're gonna have to install our new gaskets. And I'm not going to be hooking up the fuel line just yet. I wanna run some fuel through it first, make sure that it's coming out clean, and then we'll go ahead and hook it up to our new clean carburetor. Now, before you run it, you always want to check the oil. I did before I fired it up that first time with carb cleaner. The oil was low, but I went and added some oil. So you guys can see we're at the top of the dipstick. This engine, the Honda G100, takes 0.45 liters of 10W40. So that's approximately 450 milliliters of oil. Now, with that being said, here's one thing that a lot of you may not know about these Honda engines. Not only do they have the dipstick or the oil cap there, but a lot of them have one on the backside, and that is because a lot of these Honda engines are built so that they can go into a variety of different frames, whether it be like a generator, an air compressor, a mini bike, whatever. You always want to have access to at least one oil fill cap. Now, I had a mini bike that a customer said was leaking oil underneath the chain guard, and similar to this setup, what I found was when I removed everything, the oil cap was just loose. So I went ahead and tightened it up, oil leak fixed. So you always want to make sure that the one at the back is tight as well. So now that I've gone over just about everything I could, I'm ready to fire this thing up. So I've removed the air intake cap. We are going to put the choke on, as well as put the fuel on. My switch is set to the on position, so I'll go ahead and give this thing a pull. Wow, fired up on the first pull. There you guys have it. Brownie's third lung with an Amazon carburetor. Started on the first pull. Runs mint. I don't even have to make an air fuel adjustment. That thing runs pretty good. I am running it in the shop here though, so I didn't want to run it too long, but this thing runs awesome. So I'll go ahead and recap the air intake just to make sure that nothing falls in there that could get into the air compressor. And then what I like to do, just a little inspection here, go around your carb, your fuel line. I don't see any fuel leaking. As always, if you have a fuel shut-off valve, go ahead and shut it off if you're not using it. I always put the choke back on because generally you have to choke these things whenever you start them. And then as a little tip, whenever I shut off one of these engines that have one of these shut-off switches, I always like to turn it back on so this thing's ready to start right away. Well, that's going to be it for today's video. Like you guys saw, $18 Amazon carb fired up on the first pull, ran smooth, didn't even have to make an adjustment. You can't beat that. Like you guys saw, the old one wasn't worth the time or the money to put into it. With that being said, I want to give a big shout out to my customer, Richard, for dropping this thing off because I love working on cool, unique items such as this. Brownie's third lung diving station, brought all the way down here from Florida. Awesome stuff. Glad I was able to share it with you guys and super happy that I could get this repair done. Like I said, I really lucked out finding that carburetor with prime shipping for like $18 on Amazon Canada. And on the topic of carburetors, I did want to add a photo of another carburetor that I found for, I think it was like $14.99. So $15. It included a fuel filter with it, but you guys are going to notice, I think it only had like 5 reviews and they were like 3.5 star out of 5. So I spent a little bit extra money, got the $18 carburetor that had 660 4.5 star reviews. And like you guys saw, this thing fired right up, ran great. But with that being said, if you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week. Check the channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.